April 2025, in Trémolat, a quiet, quaint French village east of Bordeaux, the 600 residents learn some shocking news.
C'est ici, devant sa maison, que Karen Beaumont-Carter, une Britannique de 65 ans, a été retrouvée morte mardi soir.
One of their number, a British South African expat called Karen Carter, had been stabbed to death.
Les enquêteurs parlent d'une attaque rapide, très brutale.
Investigators told local news it was a rapid and brutal attack, very much intended to kill.
La suspicion est partout.
Suspicion is everywhere. People are watching everyone's every move. And it's out of the ordinary.
Donc voilà, et les gens se calfeutrent.
So people are staying indoors again in the evenings and taking maximum precautions that were previously unheard of in the village where calm and serenity once reigned.
Dans ce village, aller tuer cette femme sans rien.
In this village, who is going to kill this woman without taking anything, without stealing anything? It's at the very least astonishing.
An enormous murder inquiry was launched, and slowly a story of obsession, romance, and unrequited love was uncovered.
A violent death in a place of such outstanding beauty and tranquility, it's shocking. The characters involved, the portrayal of the situation as this love triangle, I suppose it has all the elements of a true life Netflix drama. I think that's one reason why people are really engaged with it.
Our reporter has been all over this case from the very start to a very recent breakthrough. The story today, murder in the Dordogne.
I first became aware of it in the headlines on news websites out of England. She was initially described as a British expat who was murdered in this picturesque village in France.
Jane Flanagan is Times Africa correspondent living in Cape Town. She has been writing about the murder of Karen Carter for over a year now.
It was only when I became aware that she was actually South African and travelling on a British passport that I became involved and was asked to find out a bit more about her.
And confusingly, to throw another country into the mix, we're actually, for the large part of this story, in southwest France, a place called, I'm going to say this wrong, Trémolat?
Trémolat is right.
Perfect. You've been there. What's it like?
Oh, it's exquisite. There's been a settlement there for 1,000 years, so the buildings are very old, very beautiful stone buildings. There's a village square surrounded by forests, fields, very close to that iconic horseshoe bend in the Dordogne River that is synonymous with that part of France that weaves through the Périgord countryside. It's absolutely sublime.
And we'll get into how this case has affected that part of the world. But of course, it's a place that has a history of trouble and division because of all what happened in the war.
Yeah, during the Second World War, this was a part of France where there was a divide in the town, really, between those who had collaborated with the German occupiers and those who resisted it. And it split villages in this part of France and created this atmosphere of mistrust. Mistrust towards outsiders, mistrust between schisms in the villages. I really do feel that sort of atmosphere of accusation and counter-accusation, suspicion, gossip, rumour is filtered into the walls of Trémolat, and that atmosphere of suspicion and who can be trusted has survived long after the war ended and the collaborators were dealt with.
So tell us about Karen and how she got there then. As you say, she was South African, but why did she pick this particular part of southwest France, do we think?
So the Carters are from South Africa, from a place called East London in the Eastern Cape province, a very beautiful stretch of coastline. Karen's parents were actually British, who moved initially to Zimbabwe and then to South Africa. Her husband, Alan Carter's parents, were also British and very much an international family. Karen Carter had lived for some time in the UK. She'd also lived in America. And the Carters first went to Trémolat in about 2009 to visit friends who had a house there. And she just was immediately struck by it, fell in love with it. the village life, the food, the wine, the countryside. And they immediately bought a home there, which they spent years and years renovating. But Karen wanted to spend more time there. And it was really the post-Brexit, COVID, pandemic, lockdown period, which actually forced her to spend more time there to get residency. She was stuck there between a couple of lockdowns. And more, she felt safe there. South Africa, as you know, has a big violent crime problem. She felt safe there, a place where she could sleep with her door open, no electric fences, no armed response teams, nothing like that. It was just somewhere where she felt incredibly safe.
And so she lived there doing what? And her husband was where? Was he back in South Africa or was he with her?
I think for the first few years, they divided their time between South Africa and Trémolat. They bought this property called Les Ouettes, which means the owls in French. It was a cottage and a barn that they renovated, and they renovated them so they became really gorgeous gîtes, holiday homes. And they rented out the cottage and the barn as holiday homes in the summer, and in between enjoyed the property themselves with their children. They've got 4 grown-up children between them who live around the world. And it was a place of family holidays. What seems to have happened is after Brexit and during the pandemic, because Karen Carter was really forced to spend more time in France, she became more embedded in the local community and wanted to spend more time there. Alan Carter still runs environmental practice. He's an environmental consultant. He still has lots of business interests in South Africa and seems to work full time. So it was impossible for him to be in France full time. But they were discussing, and I think fair to say there were tensions between them about how much time they should spend in France and how much time they should spend in South Africa.
So husband Alan is in South Africa for the most part. Karen is in southwest France. She did have, how would we describe it, an affair, a relationship with somebody while she's in France. Who was that and how did that start?
Yeah, that was Jean-François Gourrier, who lived on the edge of a village, a retired IT executive. He's fluent in English, fluent in French, and another outsider into Trémolat. They met at a place called Café Village. So in the center of the village is an old wooden building, and it's had many lives as a pizza restaurant, as a village shop. And during the pandemic, it was closed. And after the lockdown, the village came together and decided that they were going to turn it into a volunteer social hub, somewhere that the people in Trémolat could gather. Very disparate community in Trémolat. You've got old French families. You've got the expats who don't speak a lot of French. You've got French professionals who've moved from Paris and other big cities and towns who've moved to Trémolat to have a quieter life. And I think pre-COVID, those communities had really never had the opportunity or the place to come together. And Café Village was born out of that incredible charge of energy that came through the village at the end of the lockdown. And it was at Café Village that Karen Carter met Jean-François Gourrier.
But do we know that in their community, would people have known about that, or was it a very secret affair?
Certainly, they were trying to keep any relationship very discreet, perhaps because it was a new relationship. I don't think Karen Carter was someone who enjoyed being the subject of gossip, and there is a lot of gossip in a small place like that with only a few hundred residents. So they were being discreet, and it was only after she was found dead outside her home that more emerged about the nature of that relationship.
Tell us about what happened the night she dies. It was the 29th of April, 2025. Where was she? What was she doing?
So Karen spent the early part of that evening at a wine tasting at Gourrier's house. One of the roles that she had at the Café Village was to run the bar with him, and they were testing new wines. He was hosting about 10 or a dozen people for the evening. It seems that she was the last to leave. She recently got a dog, and she had the dog with her, and she drove home back to her converted barn, and Gourrier followed at a discreet distance at about 10 o'clock that night. He later told police when he arrived at her driveway, he found her bleeding next to her car. She'd been stabbed multiple times, and he phoned the authorities, but she was declared dead at the scene. It seems as though she pulled up outside her barn, got out, was gathering the dog, her bag, when she was confronted by her killer. She was stabbed 8 times, including one of the wounds was to her aorta. So I imagine, she bled to death very quickly after that. It was, police said, a frenzied attack, very violent, very sudden. So she wasn't expecting that.
I'm sure news like that travels very quickly around a small place in France, as you've described. But how did news reach her family all over the world?
Yeah, that was a terrible shock for them. Alan Carter, I spoke to him the day after. I was the first reporter to phone him, which surprised me. And he told me that he'd found out via a cousin who saw a note posted on the Café Village Facebook group saying, there's been terrible news, we're closing indefinitely, and sounded serious. So inquiries were made, and it was revealed that Karen Carter, who was so central to the life of that operation, had died. And Alan, whose cousin owns a house in the village, was phoned to be told this terrible news. He then had to break the news to the adult children who are scattered all over the world.
And I think you spoke to those as well, didn't you? I mean, how did they feel about it all?
I mean, just terrible shock. Terrible shock. Can't make sense of it. Their lovely mother, who was so popular, so full of fun, enthusiasm for life, just killed in a place they knew well, a place where they'd had so many family holidays. Killed in such a violent, sudden, pointless way. Just imagining how terrified she must have been, how helpless she was in that moment. That's something that really haunts those children.
And a delicate issue for you, I guess, now on this case, reporting on it, speaking to them, is how do you broach the hitherto secret fact that she was maintaining an affair many, many miles away from her husband? I mean, did you ask him about that?
I went to see Ellen, and actually went to East London to see him at his house where he was preparing to travel to France. You feel very much like you're intruding in people's lives. You're sitting with people who've just absorbing this terrible news. It was also then announced by the police that the person they were looking for had a grudge against Karen, or this relationship she had started with the man in the village.
Un règlement de compte sentimental.
A settling of romantic scores is the lead being followed primarily by police.
So it was, automatic that I would ask Alan what he knew about that. And he was devastated. I mean, he did talk about a sense of betrayal to me, as well as absorbing that news of his wife being brutally murdered. He did tell me he'd asked her and said, you seem to be spending a lot of time with him, doing all these wine tastings and socializing together. I think he had a very strong feeling that that didn't seem right. And that had been denied by her. And as I was sitting with Alan, I was also in touch with colleagues who were in Trémolat. A lot of media went to the village to speak to neighbours, to find out what people knew. And so I was getting quite a lot of information from Trémolat about what the gossip was, what neighbours said they'd seen, what the theories that people had. So I felt, I should give Alan the opportunity of, would you like me to tell you what people are saying to reporters? Because these are things that are going to be reported in the paper, maybe later today, maybe tomorrow. Is it that you want to be prepared for what is published so that you can be prepared yourself and prepare your family?
Was he hungry for information, or was he trying to avoid that kind of thing?
One thing I appreciated about Alan is he was very honest and authentic. And yes, he did want to know, because I think his primary concern was to protect his children. So he felt like he needed to manage the news on their behalf as well.
When did you first go to Trémolat?
I'm the Africa correspondent. I don't go to France for my work, but it did seem, after I'd had this series of conversations with Alan Carter, And yeah, I suppose the relationship I'd built with him, the job of a reporter, it can, especially a news reporter, we don't see people usually on the best day of their lives. We see them when they've gone through something terrible quite often, whether it's a natural disaster, a crime. You're engaging with people when they're very, very vulnerable. That can be a very challenging part of the job because you're balancing the commitment you have to the people who've sent me to report, the newspaper, the Times, my editor. But also, I'm somebody who's engaging with other human beings at their most vulnerable. And, when I first met Alan Carter at his house, he didn't even have a number for the police. He didn't know how to make contact with them. And I said, well, let me contact my colleague in Paris. Maybe we can get a number or an email address. Who's the prosecutor dealing with this? He really didn't have any basic information about who was even investigating his wife's murder. You're not trained to handle those situations, but they come up very naturally in these kind of intense news events, whereby you also have to do what you can to make sure that what you're doing in the line of work doesn't make a bad situation even worse for someone. And it was from that I realized that, if there was going to be further reporting from France for the Times, there were other reporters there, it would make sense for me to go because I already knew much more than I'd written. Alan had been very frank with me. I had a good understanding of the case and the family and the sensitivities and so on. So it made sense that I would go to France after him and replace my colleague who was already there.
When you got there, how did you find the place and how was Alan returning to that town as well?
It was such a sad, lonely journey for him, going on his own to Trémolat, going back to a place of happy memories, family, holidays, to just horror.
What did you see when you were there?
This exquisite village and this beautiful property that they owned, now taped off with police tape, horrible stain in the drive. They really were the only clues that anything terrible had happened. But what a terrible thing had happened. And the village, to all sense and purposes, on superficial inspection, looked like it was gearing up for a lovely summer.
And yet they must have been terrified. I take your point that gossip will always be rife in a place like that. But if it was the kind of place where you felt like you could go to sleep and have your door unlocked, all of a sudden to be confronted with an as yet unresolved crime like that must send a real shock through the community.
Absolutely. This is a village where there's never been anything like this. You might get a bit of petty theft, and that's it. Everybody knows everybody. A suspicious car, someone who doesn't normally walk on that lane, picked up immediately. When I was moving around the village, you immediately draw suspicion because, they don't know my face. And for this to happen was incredibly shocking. But immediately the amateur sleuthing begins.
So Jane, as you were in southwest France doing all of your reporting on this case, of course the police must surely be hard at work trying to figure out who did this crime. What do they do in those first few days? Who do they question? Who do they look at?
Well, there was a massive police presence in the village immediately after Karen Carter was found murdered. Police dogs, helicopters. There's a huge expanse of forest behind her house. That was a natural place for them to look, but also a very challenging place for them to look. Quite soon after, they brought in two people for questioning. One was Jean-François Guerrier and one was Marie-Laure Hautefort. Jean-François was the man that Karen Carter was in a relationship with. Marie-Laure was a neighbour of the Carters who was known in the village to have been infatuated with Guerrier, and this was not something that she made a secret of. Jean-François was interviewed first, released quite quickly. Marie-Laure Hautefort was held for about 40 hours, and then she was released, and the police continued their investigation.
And what do we know about her?
So Marie-Laure is from one of the village's oldest families. So she has spent all her life in Trémolat. She's written the book on Trémolat's history. She is a well-known character in the village. She would not have been a friend of Karen Carter. She doesn't speak any English. They met through Café Village. She was a former scrub nurse who in later life became a carer. And at the time of Karen's killing, she was 68 and her house is on the other side of the woods, backing onto the Carter's property.
And you say that she was infatuated with, in love with Guerrier, the man who was having an affair with Karen, and that she made no secret about that, Marie-Laure. How so?
Well, her brother, Philippe Monribeau, who I spoke to when I was in Trémolat at the time, I mean, he shared that information very freely. She had been obsessed with Guerrier. She'd met him through the Café Village and was so determined to be in a relationship with him that she even left her own husband so she could be free for that to happen. She told her family stories of, beautiful chateaus that he had taken her to wine and dine her and so on. There's no evidence that ever happened. And certainly, according to Jean-François Guerrier, he had made it clear to her that her affection was not returned. But also, it was such a violent, terrible attack. Philippe doesn't think would be capable of doing it.
And she spoke to police, but as you say, was then released. What happened then?
There were now another year of investigation carried out by the police. They interviewed and took statements from hundreds of people. They took DNA samples from scores of people, including all the people who had been at the wine tasting on the night that Karen Carter died, including the mayor. And one of the reasons why they had to take so many DNA samples was that there was a sample of DNA at the scene and they wanted to rule people out. But as far as we're aware, no murder weapon has ever been found. And, it was a long time. I think in the UK, we would not imagine that there wouldn't be enough evidence to arrest and charge someone within a year of an attack like that. And yet there wasn't a breakthrough for a year.
And through that point, how did Alan feel about all of this, her husband?
It was very frustrating for the Carters to have no real sign of progress in the case. They were assured by the police that they were taking it very seriously, that no stone was left unturned, and that they were very motivated to find the killer. But in this gap of any breakthrough, of course, there was a huge amount of speculation in the village. Alan Carter was someone who was implicated by people in the village, saying that he had a motive because his wife had found another man, that even though he was on the other side of the world, he would have been able to hire a hitman to go and finish off his wife. I think perhaps it was easier for people in Trémolat to imagine that someone on the other side of the world had paid a stranger to come in and kill Karen Carter and then leave the scene. That's easier to believe and more comfortable to believe than actually imagining there's a killer among you in a village. Alan Carter has been over to Trémolat several times, since his wife was killed, always visiting the police, handing in his laptop, his phone, offering DNA to show that he was cooperating. He had nothing to hide. And more than anyone, he wanted this terrible crime to be solved. So it was incredibly difficult for the Carters, dealing with their awful shock, their grief, not knowing what had happened, but at the same time being the subject of this terrible suspicion.
So we have this vacuum and this seeming lack of progress until July this year. What happened?
So in July, we had the news that Marie-Laure Hautefort had been placed under investigation on suspicion of premeditated murder. That's the closest thing we have in the UK of being charged. But the French and British systems are quite different. The British process is more accusatorial. The prosecution accuses someone of something, they mount a defense, they go to a court, the jury decides. In France, it's more inquisitorial. So there's one investigating judge who runs the whole investigation, and he chases evidence both for and against the suspect. And that's why it's so slow. now in a situation where Marie-Laure is mise en examen, which means not just charged, but there's serious evidence worth pursuing. It is as though they believe they have their suspect and they continue with the investigation to see what evidence they have to bring her to trial.
And do we know what evidence has been collected?
It's not clear what the evidence is, but a lot of people have access to a case file in France, so you can pick up hints in the French media from reporters who have contacts within the French police. We have read stories that she has not stuck to a consistent story about her feelings for Guerriere or what she knew about his relationship with Karen Carter. That has raised suspicion. I understand there is some phone evidence as well.
We should add that Marie-Laure Hautefeuille's lawyers have not responded to an email asking whether Hautefeuille had confessed or had rejected the accusations after she was charged. However, last year, after Hautefeuille was questioned, she did deny any involvement in the crimes.
Do we know how the town has responded to all of this? I mean, the sort of charges, you explained it there, but also I guess the fact that there are still so many question marks hanging over this case, which happened a decent chunk of time ago now.
Well, from what I understand from the people I've spoken to in the village, the people who don't think Marie-Laure Hautefeuille is capable of this crime still believe that and don't think that anything has changed by this development in the investigation, because they just can't fathom that someone that they've known for such a long time would be capable of doing it. And the people who suspect Alan Carter continue to do so.
How does Alan feel about all of this, the current progress in the case and Karen's family?
They're extremely relieved that there has been this breakthrough, but they're very mindful that this is not a trial, it's not a conviction, it's just the police expressing the view that they believe they have their suspect and they're continuing to build the case. There is relief that it seems to have ruled Alan out of suspicion, whether some people in Trémolat accept that or not. So I've spoken to Alan and he said, we're obviously relieved that there's been progress and they're hoping for a trial and a conviction, and that's really when they can start to grieve. And he said he's hopeful that eventually the family can enjoy Trémolat again in the future if they can get past this. They're not sure if they can, but they are prepared to give it a try.
That was Jane Flanagan, Africa correspondent for The Times. We will link to her extensive and exclusive reporting on this case in the description of this episode, so you can have a read. And if you thought this was interesting, why not send the episode along to a friend so they can listen as well? And do subscribe yourself for free to this feed so that you will never miss an episode. That is it from us today. The producer was Sophie McNulty. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design was by Ivan Eastley. And theme composition was by Maula Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.